You're tuned into RX Radio. Movement prescribed. Brought to you by Prescript.com. A personalized approach to keeping you healthy and making your best even better. Your hosts, Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Jordan Jinta.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Another episode of RX Radio. Okay, so this is like a lesson in adulthood. So I woke up like last week at some point, and my microphone on my camera on my phone wasn't working. And for those of you who don't know, I do like Q&As probably, I don't know, anywhere between once a day to once every 2 weeks. And I did a Q&A and realized very quickly that my microphone did not work. So I had to like type them all up. Now, I just like kind of organizing my thoughts out loud, but also in my head, and oftentimes simultaneously in my head and out loud at the same time. Hence, 200 and however many fucking episodes of this podcast, right? So demented ramblings are my MO. So I was sort of handcuffed. I did this Q&A, and there were some good questions, and I didn't think to just abandon all hope and just not answer them. So I typed them out kind of like the old-fashioned way. And one of the questions was actually from a friend of mine. His name was Dan Casson, or I suppose it still is Dan Casson, unless he's changed it in the last week. But Dan asked, what are your thoughts on the hook lying position? And so I said some things, right? And that's what I do. I say things. I do things, but I also say things. And I say things about what I see and also about what I do. So the hook lying position, and like I had a fairly, poignant view on it and its place in training and its over-popularization. Or that's just, that's not fair. It's popularization of late, just sort of in the internet circles of training that I've been seeing. And I guess my response crossed the desks of one Kyle Dobbs. Now, Kyle's a man who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. Him and his partner, Matt Domney, business partner, Matt Domney. They run Compound Performance. They do great stuff in the education space. And Kyle and I have spoken many occasions. Now, this is where the first lesson starts. Kyle apparently has been earmarked or pigeonholed as the steward of all things hook lying on the internet, which much to his chagrin, my demented rambling story, speaking my opinions, let's say, on the hook lying position in training was shared to him many a time. And that sparked up a dialogue between Kyle and I. And as mentioned, Kyle's someone I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and not only for his academic prowess, but for his professionalism. Kyle reached out and said, hey, man, I got this like 10 times. Let's talk. And I said, absolutely, man. How about I do you one better and let's talk on the podcast. So the bigger lesson to take away from today's episode, and it's a fucking banger, could go toe-to-toe with this guy and just reference for reference with this guy all day, every which way. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I wish we recorded the video. It was basically us just nodding our head at each other as we looked at different sides of the same coin. This is adulting, people. Like, get with the fucking program. So there are things we saw eye to eye with. There are things that we didn't. And guess what? We both get great results, and we both offer tremendous service, and we work with great coaches. And it's like, this is how the universe works. So huge shout out to Kyle, first and foremost. Thank you, man, honestly, for taking the time first to reach out like an adult, like the professional that you are, and to share your wisdom and knowledge with us on the podcast was really special. This podcast has evolved over time and started at a very technical place. And those of you who've been down since the jump, we appreciate you. It's gotten some weird turns in love late, talking about life and business and philosophy and psychology and money and whatever. We talk about a bunch of random shit. But this episode meant a lot to me to get back to some of the technical roots, really try and highlight some important fundamental principles, regardless of your ethos around biomechanics. So again, Kyle Dobbs, check him out, Instagram, Compound Performance. He does some great work. His His mentorships run quarterly. Make sure you keep an eye on that. Again, I can't say enough good things about him and what he does, and more importantly, how and why he does it. All thumbs up across the board here. I've really appreciated this whole experience. Hopefully, if you guys like it, reach out, let us know. Do the whole screen share thing. Tag Compound Performance, Kyle Dobbs, and myself, RX Radio. And perhaps we'll do this again. I like going in on the mechanic stuff with those people that can really push me. And Kyle's definitely one of those people. So, guys, without any further ado, I'm rambling. Enjoy the episode. Kyle Dobbs, Compound Performance, RX Radio. We'll see you guys next week.
But do you find the transition into the online easier because you had, like, all technical prowess aside, right, and all like maybe business learning curves and like iterations of the courses over time? Do you find that the fact that you have so many reps face to face, that at a certain point you do realize that delivering the service online in some ways is easier, some ways more difficult, but in some ways easier rather?
Yeah, I mean, I think that exposure is huge. It's just like any other stimulus, right? Where, exposure is going to lead to more options and essentially, hopefully better options for the people that you're working with. We're also very clear about who our training audience is. Like like the people that we train from a client perspective are almost exclusively coaches or athletes. And most of them also have very high training ages, right? So it's like when we're programming for them, if we're programming a certain position or we're programming certain conditioning protocols or, just exercise variants, acute variables, whatever, like the majority of them don't need a huge in-depth explanation to understand what we're trying to get out of that, and I think that makes it way easier. We definitely say no to a lot of people. If they come to us and they're, again, like in a bridge program for like post-rehabilitative work or something of that nature, it's like, you probably need somebody in person. Like if you can do that, like I'm very conscious of our scope and respectful of other scopes for sure. If we've got people who come to us that just have, a zero training age and don't know their way around a facility or a gym, haven't really trained, especially like under stress, we're probably not the ones for you. And a part of that is just our preference and our bias where, we want the clients that we kind of have to tap the brakes on, not the ones we have to constantly push the accelerator for. We want the people who are like overshooting their RPs a little bit, that we have to tell to back off a little bit, and they're excited about the training process and they're kind of going all into it. And when we have people who just kind of more of the novice, like that's just not necessarily our crowd. And I think the more specific you get from a training perspective, the better off you're going to be when you're looking at remote. I don't think you can be everything to everybody from that perspective when it comes to looking at your actual training demographic and trying to work with like novice athletes versus more experienced athletes. When you can't get that in-person relationship and have those conversations with people, it's really hard to work with new people who might need some of that feedback and some of that cueing like they would get in an in-person relationship.
Yeah, and the one thing you don't see, like talking about that exclusion criteria, is because the scalable, like remote programming, coaching, education is just that it's completely scalable. Mm-hmm. And that, we use social media as a tool in which to kind of relay the message and market to an audience. It's good to see that exclusion criteria being implemented at some sort of like a gatekeeper, being like, hey, I know you like the stuff we post, but it's like, you can't do quantum physics unless you know 2 + 2. Like we're kind of over here, and it's like, you spend 5 years doing stuff wrong and maybe figuring some stuff out right, because that's something you don't see a lot. Like the exclusion criteria for most things is, do you have money? Oh, you have money. Well, hey, let me tell you what we got for you. Come on down. It's like the price is right. It's just like everyone's a contestant, but it's like, it's nice to see. And you see it too, like, and the filtering process definitely manifests itself in the results that you're going to get, right? Like you're protecting that objective outcome by making sure that people are good candidates for the training you guys are doing or the education you guys are putting out. Because it's like, I mean, I know like in just following peripherally, like I'd like to think I have a decent conceptualization of like anatomy and biomechanics, And there's like, and I know I put stuff out where I'm like, okay, this might actually be purposely trying to lose people, but there's a handful of people where I look at and like, okay, no, they get it. So it's like, you guys definitely speak to your audience. Like, it's not the old bait and switch. It's not like, oh, we're going to do this thing and then come in, we're going to teach you something totally different. Which is, to me, it's like, it's the long-term play, right? Like flash in the pan stuff is, clickbait. It's like, there's no clickbait. It's like, you guys treat your Instagrams like Twitter. It's like, what is going on here? I just read tiles and then it's you running 1,000 miles an hour, but it's like, that's what you're going to get, right? From the second you're in the door to the second you're out the other side of like the mentorship program, that's what you're to expect. So the transparency is nice to see, because like you hear a lot in the industry of like, oh, that's not really what I expected. And it's like, well, you get out, or you get in what you put out, sort of thing.
Yeah. It's funny because we just had our first call for this group, and like, that's an entire slide in our first presentation model, where it's like, we're not here to, teach you our model necessarily and the things that we do. Like, we will use those things as an example, but we don't want you trying to replicate our exact model, because you don't work with the same audience that we do, and you don't have the same education experience that we do, right? So it's not going to come across the same contextually with your training demographic, right? So we're here to help you optimize what you do as best as you possibly can, and provide you the tools to do that thing, make it scalable, and then make it a better product just from an efficacy perspective. And I think the big thing there is like our that slide literally says like, you will get out of this what you put into it. And that's it. If you're diving into it, if you're getting head first, if you're on the calls or at least watching the recordings, if you're on the Slack forum, asking questions, being involved in communication, if you're running the actual programs themselves and seeing how we use these things in a contextual, programming perspective, like, you will get out of this. If you're doing the document, right, that we provide for you, the case study, right, you will get the most out of this. If you're here to be a passive observer, and you just kind of want to, say you're in the program and make a few of the calls and maybe kind of lurk on the Slack channel a little bit, like, you're not going to get that much out of it. And it might not be the same. It might not be what you wanted. We pretty much offer people like full refunds in week 1. And just say like, hey, if this isn't for you, it's not for you. There's no hard feelings. I'm not going to block you on Instagram or anything. I hope you, continue to, check out our content and whatever. But we also don't want to take your money if it's not what you're looking for, because we're super conscientious about that.
I mean, sometimes no means not right now, right?
Yeah,
like, it's like,
for sure,
because you do need a fundamental basis. Like, you need to be able, like, in a similar context to math, like, if you can't do very basic math in your head, it's like, well, we're flying through equations here where it's like, you can't be tripping over 2 + 2, right? So it's it's interesting to see, because you can't keep everyone happy, which is something that I've learned probably the hardest way possible in the last couple of years, and especially in the online space, where when you're teaching, it's like, you can't open up and like create a dialogue. We do lab sections, and you guys have like Slack channels and things where there is room for dialogue. So hopefully you can contextualize things a bit, but there's just always going to be, no matter how hard you try, there's going to be a few that slip past the goalie and they're just not pleased. And it's like, hey, again, like, no harm, no foul. Like, throw your hands up and just be like, that's totally cool, man. Different strokes for different folks, as they say. Because, and I wanted to kind of dig to like a little bit more into the technical side, because that's how this conversation started. But before I got into it, I actually wanted to address the professionalism that comes with, like, one of my sayings is how you do one thing is how you do everything. Right. And it's like, I'm a firm believer in that. So in the way this conversation came about was I put up some bright-eyed, bushy-tailed approach on the hook lying position, to which you became the internet's arbiter and sole shepherd of said position. And then a dialogue ensued. And then it was like, hey, let's talk about it. Because I think because Instagram is not a place for context. It's not a place for conversation. Like, it's not a place for exclusion criteria or inclusion criteria. I was like, well, fuck, like, let's just, rather than just going, fuck you, knife fight. But it's like, you reaching out to me, it was like, fuck, like, this is exactly what I expected from what I see, right? It's that transparency. It's the professionalism. It's the how you do one thing is how you do everything. So you're like, yeah, fuck yeah. Like, let's do it. And here we are, like, 4 days later. So this started by me, like, I don't know, it was pre-coffee, early morning Q&A. My microphone was broken and I was pissed. And it was a question about the hook lying position. Now, immediately I got feedback going, okay, what is the hook lying position? Number one. And then I Google searched it for a few people and sent that off to them, because apparently that was too difficult. But because I want this to be a gateway into. So the way we break down like anatomy, and we teach it in level 1 is like shoulder, hip, and spine. So sort of peripheral, I call it like our peripheral hubs. And then we go into the central hub, pelvis and ribcage. Right. So our level 2 curriculum is ribcage and pelvis. And I know a lot in the space that we sort of, the center of our Venn diagram is probably going to be somewhere centered around the ribcage and pelvis. And that's going to be, and I think, large and part of the conversation today, especially around the hook lying position. So just run with that. Hook lying position, pelvis, rib cage, Kyle Dobbs, compound performance. Huzzah, go.
So I want to start by saying I actually laughed a lot out loud at your post.
Dude, I got to cut you off before I get started. I called Phil Daru yesterday.
Yeah.
Like, because I know you guys are doing his rehab, and Phil scares the living shit out of me. Like, he's terrified. And like I'm in Florida at the moment. And I know like he's doing his knee or post ACL rehab. And so I see him a lot doing it. And I posted it. I saw Phil doing something. Like, he's going to beat the shit out of me when I'm in. So I got immediately scared. I'm like, fuck. Phil's going to like fucking rear naked choke me or some shit when I get down to Florida. Sorry. I just had to interject with that.
No, he's absolutely crushing it. And again, I think this is just context is everything, right? Because And I thought it's probably good. It's good feedback for me as well that so many people shared that with me, because that was the impetus of me reaching out to you. Was I got somewhere between like 10 and 15 like people that like sent me that, that story, and they're like, hey, what the fuck, man? Like, what do you think about this? And it's like, wow, I must post a lot of hook lying shit, and maybe probably too much because I'm not giving people the right context of how we do it, right? And so from a biomechanics perspective, all we're trying to do is look at the axial skeleton and kind of creating, a quote unquote stack, which I'm not a huge fan of the term stack, because I look at that kind of stacking position where the rib cage is over the pelvis. For most people, is from an athletic standpoint, it's a starting point, right? It's basically creating the most neutral positioning possible so that you can get into different compression strategies from a posterior, anterior, lateral perspective for whatever your sport demands are. But what it also does, and how we kind of look at it, is that stack allows for essentially maximum mobility of the scapula and the humerus up top, and then from the femur and the iliums down below, right? So it allows those things to coordinate reciprocally of one another in a larger range of motion typically. So most of our clients are strength athletes or, dynamic athletes, strong people. And those people typically exhibit a lot of posterior compression, which is going to be like thoracic and lumbar extension, right? They're the big chesters, right? They're strong. They've got a lot of compression anterior to posterior from a ribcage standpoint, and they typically don't have a ton of scapular and humeral range of motion. And when they bench, they exacerbate that by creating more of an arch and then retracting the rib cage and getting a wider hand grip, right? So they decrease the range of motion even more for outputs, which is a really good strategy for lifting as much weight as you can. But it's not a great strategy for dynamic movement and movement variability of the shoulder complex, right? Which most sports actually require. You want to throw a baseball, you're probably not going to be retracted the whole time. In Phil's case, you want to throw a punch, you're not going to be retracted the whole time, right? So what we look at is most of our training is going to be a concurrent model where we have a primary bench day where we let people retract and go, right? Like when I have that in the programming for people, literally my notes say, just send it, like just fucking go. And then we have a secondary bench day where we might have like a hook lying position that allows for a more retracted ribcage and more scapular protraction and humeral internal rotation as you're going through that flexion process. So we're just opening up the other end of range of motion to give people exposure under load to that. And for us, it's like the equivalent of like a front squat to a back squat, right? You're looking at different load displacement. It's still a squat, but you're going through a different range of motion respective to the shoulder or to the hips and the knees, right? You're getting more knee flexion and potentially more hip flexion and a more upright torso within that front squat than you are the back squat. Back squat's going to be a little more horizontal translation of a pelvis and a little more posterior dominant, right? When you look at a hook lying bench compared to a more traditional bench press, all we're doing is looking at more concentric orientation of the pecs because you're actually getting more humeral internal rotation and adduction upon flexion. So we're just looking at increasing that range of motion and showing people or giving people exposure to the other side of that.
I make the comparison, and I wrote this in the little blind rant there about like the stack position. And I think we both know you, Angus Bradley.
Mm-hmm.
So I've known Angus for years. I was actually like one of the first podcasts I did eons ago was actually with the High Performance podcast with Angus, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And he put up one of his little, like one quote thing about about contextualizing the stacked, because it's not about being in the stacked position. And I think you kind of giving context to that sort of give credence to the way I look at it. And I think one of the underlying issues in understanding stacked versus unstacked and hook lying versus not, and like what I would refer to as like a stacked position is maybe training more in safe mode and using this as maybe like just a means of auto regulation, right? If nothing else, it's like you cannot press as much, but this is yet still a press, right? So we can start to challenge movements over muscles and start to get into ranges that we otherwise couldn't. So like a feet up bench press, for example, like without a box underneath your legs, maintaining hook lying position, creating that, and to sample maybe, and hopefully I do this properly, to create that strategy internally rather than passive externally is just going to be a means of auto-regulating load. Like, what do you think about feet up bench press or Larson press? It's like, other than using weird Lieutenant Dan references, I don't know if it does anything else, but really just, decrease your overall exposure to load at the end of the day from a programming perspective, right? So I think with athleticism, it's not about being stacked. It's about being able to stack and unstack, right? And like moving within the stacked and unstacked position. So gaining familiarity, because it's funny. I look at it in a similar fashion with like non-axial loading. So it's more like appendicular loading, like the prone hamstring curl, for example. Yep. I'll teach an internally stacked prone hamstring position so that we can use this as an associative means of teaching hopefully a better autonomous like sprint stride. Right. If a lot of people are unstacking, going into an anterior pelvic tilt, relying on the external stability of the prone hamstring curl machine, and then you remove that external stabilization and you remove that ability to, have the spine be stable by the external environment of the machine. And then you have someone like laying flat out for a 40, and they're kicking themselves in the back of the head. It's like, hold them, you got to learn how to get into the stack and be dangerous. And this is one thing, like, again, that was probably got lost in the rant there, was like, one thing I teach about the stack is like, you need to learn how to be dangerous in the stack position, because that licenses you an ability to go out because where home base is. If you're dangerous in a stack position, you're going to, because, Johan Blake is dangerous in a stack position because he's laying out sub 100 meters like for the past 15 years. Right. So, and it's a lot of it, again, just gets miscontextualized. And I think one of the biggest things, the last point before I throw it back to you, is the way you reference movement of the rib cage, right? Like retracted. And like when you start to talk about like internal and external rotation of the rib cage, I think that loses people because, it's easy for us to look at a shoulder through a triplanar model and see flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and then obviously internal and external rotation. But I think we get taught at more like peripheral levels or more like pedestrian levels of anatomy that when we look at the pelvis and we look at the rib cage, we're looking at almost like these monolithic static structures, which I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Like I could look at your shoulder and be like, okay, I don't know, maybe if you had a dislocation, I could see a flat deltoid. I can't necessarily derive a working understanding of your function of your shoulder based off of the visible structure of your shoulder. The same with the hip. I could look at like your hip joint, your femoral acetabular joint, and be like, well, what are we really looking at? Can this person get into extension and internal rotation? I don't know. I can't tell by looking at them. But if I see a rib cage and I see a pelvis, that is to me it's a functional transparency in structure, where it's like the structure is going to tell me where the function is, like roughly speaking, but more so than any of our like appendicular skeleton, right? So when you refer to retraction of the rib cage, that's like a singularity moment for people. So could you sort of just explain how we use reference points to delineate whether it's retraction or rotation at the rib cage, and then if you want to dig into the pelvis a bit?
Yeah, so that's the easiest way to put that is if you're looking at a human being, from the side, right? And I'm looking at rib cage in relation to pelvis. So if I have a rib cage that's floating over the anterior part of the pelvis and like over the midfoot and forefoot, that's going to be a protracted rib cage, right? So when I talk about retracting the rib cage, all I'm talking about is moving that rib cage back in space to where it's over the pelvis and over the midfoot and heel. And we talk a lot about rib cage because your rib cage, when you're unloaded, is your center of mass, right? So when you look at gravity as a vector, you've got, load coming straight down on you. And the position of your rib cage in relation to your pelvis is going to orientate muscles into integrating for stability, right? So if your rib cage is on the front half of your pelvis, you're going to have a ton of concentric shortening of the back musculature. And it's going to create a little bit of an anterior pelvic tilt potentially, and a lot of thoracic and extension and potentially, again, lumbar extension. And you're going to have a lot of lengthening and eccentric orientation of the abdominal tissues, right? And probably even the pecs, depending on somebody trying to pull themselves back, because you're always falling forward. So you're going to have at that point musculature that is altered from a length tension ratio as well, right? So that's going to affect how you train and how you integrate those tissues into your training. So if we can get those back, we can neutralize all that tissue into its natural length tension ratio, so it can go into both lengthened and shortened states when appropriate. When we talk about the rotational aspect, right, there's a few different things there. So when I talk about like an external rotation of a rib cage, right, if I'm looking at it from a sagittal perspective, looking at that person from the side, I'm looking at essentially an anterior elevation of the rib cage, right? So again, that's going to go more into that thoracic extension where the ribs are flaring, straight up, right? And when I'm looking at a posterior tilt, I'm looking at that like hyperflexion model where I'm going to be a little kyphotic probably on the back end of things. And I'm kind of being abdomen or abcentric from that perspective. So, and the other part of this that I think almost always gets lost in translation through social media, because social media is, right, there's a big difference between talking about a retracted rib cage in absolute and retracting a rib cage in motion.
Right.
Yeah, relative to position. And typically I'm talking about relative to position, and I think that gets lost a lot of the time as well, because people think statically, because it's easier to conceptualize. And from a pelvic perspective, again, we're going to have like kind of disassociation of the actual pelvis or the iliums from the SI joint, right? And again, it's a minimal movement, but it does allow for a little bit of internal and external rotation of the actual iliums, and that's going to affect the acetabulums, right? And an external rotation of an ilium allows for an internal rotation of a femur. Those things kind of work, again, contralaterally from one another. And the ability to disassociate the iliums from one another and have them work reciprocally from one another is going to be kind of a fundamental process of gait mechanics, right? So to get into like stance and swing phases, you're going to have to externally rotate one ilia and internally rotate the other, right? So that's what I'm referring to a lot of the ways. When we're doing, when we're squatting or deadlifting, we want those things to be doing the same thing, right? In relation to pelvic tilt and kind of the function of the sacrum, whether it's in nutation or counter nutation. But when we're doing gait related things, they have to work opposite of one another. And if they don't, we're going to have gait mechanic issues where we're going to be spending a lot more time on one leg than we are the other. And we're going to have a harder time. And that's, again, if that's your right side, you might be spending a lot of time in, stance phase on your right and having a really hard time with like supination and toe push off. And you're going to be spending a lot of time in like external rotation and supination on your left and have a harder time in mid stance and pronation, right? So you can see these things all the way up and down. We look at the axial and appendicular structures the opposite that you do, where we go inside out, mainly because we're looking at the rib cage and pelvis's influence on the structures moving out.
So my, kind of contextualize my stance on like the inside out versus outside in. Like I teach it outside in for like a 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, now we know basic math. Now let's go a little bit deeper. Now, as far as like in application goes, and I want to get your stance on this, because like, corrective exercise and exercising correctly should be a spectrum of outside influence in performing tasks, right? So the way I look at like the appendicular skeleton, or like the shoulder, hip, spine model, roughly speaking, is like we can attempt to distill out isolated bouts of function at, like, say, rotator cuff serratus, like lateral hip, glute med, piriformis, adductors, whatever, single leg work or kettlebell work or something like that, attempting to integrate the function of the rotator cuff or the lateral rotator group of the hip. But and this is where, like, I've kind of been wrestling with that idea, and it's really just born out of genuine curiosity when it comes to looking at addressing pelvis and rib cage position. Training age to me is one of the biggest variables. Like, we haven't got into infrasternal angle yet, and like, I think it's easier to have a conversation around the rib cage, because unless you know the words counternutation and nutation and what that means at the sacrum and respective to the ilium, it can be a little bit confusing. But it's like, if I'm dealing with, let's say, an untrained or someone who's really just not a well-trained individual, compensations through the rib cage and pelvis to me seem like maybe like breaking it down between congenital versus acquired. Right. So it's like interventions at the rib cage and pelvis, when we see like these different orientations just sort of have to be manifested by prolonged stress and adaptation under load. Right. So then this is how I kind of look at it. So if I'm dealing at the level of the pelvis and rib cage, it's going to be with someone who is a more advanced training age, someone who's had maybe a more acquired shape and structure or function and structure of, like, let's stick with the rib cage, for example. So an intervention for me is going to have to be something that puts it in a position under load, that teaches the muscles that attach onto it that they've been training to adopt strength in these new positions. Prone hamstring curl, for example. I could take an IFBB pro, swings the full stack on a prone hamstring curl with this, this allowing for the anterior tilt and the unstacking of the pelvis. And I have them co-contract, keep your ribs down over your pelvis, sort of protract and create this expansion posteriorly through the rib cage while attempting to do a prone hamstring. All of a sudden, those hamstrings now have a different orientation because we're no longer in the lengthened phase, because we're no longer dumping that pelvis forward. We're going to see exponential changes in their ability to perform much quicker, because the skill of adaptation itself is already well trained, right? So now we're just teaching them to have horsepower on a different track. So when I look at interventions around the pelvis and rib cage, it's really going to be as we look towards more advanced athletes, people who have become the shape of their sport, and kind of this chicken and the egg relationship of, like, if we're dealing with a lineman, we're probably going to be dealing with someone who has, again, to sample language, a wider infrasternal angle, right? And that's what made them a good lineman. Right, because they want to. Well, you want to take up some room, would you? So let's just flatten you out a little bit. Let's move you a little bit over here. That would be someone who's like, okay, they need to be wide in their sport, but kind of like you said with the hook line versus non and sending it versus safe mode, it's like we need them to be a little bit safe. We need them to be a little bit round, right? Because it's like, especially when we start to deal in sports, it's like he'll get hurt in a position where he's got to act narrow as a wide, right? So it's like, where do you draw the line, or is there a line to be drawn? And I mean, I feel like the answer at the end of the day, it's like, it's reps and sets, who gives a shit, whatever. But like, how do you draw the line with training age and looking at intervention? Because like, I look at breathing interventions for a more advanced athlete unloaded, like let's take a 90-90 heel lift. And I think if I'm trying to create posterior expansion and stack position, I need to load up maybe a prime horizontal row with about 7 plates on the top pin to overload the length and position of the lat and get them to breathe into their back as they're forced into this, protracted, retracted relationship of rib cage and scap.
That's actually how we got posterior expansion with our boy Will Crozet, right? Is we put him on a T-bar, we put him on a T-bar row with 5 or 6 plates and had him just take as many deep exhales as possible. And his feedback was it was legitimately one of the most painful things he's ever done, because he felt like his rhomboids and traps were ripping off of the bone.
And for those of you who don't know Will Crozier,
Will
Crozier's traps start at his ass and they go to above his ears. I've competed against Will. I've been in the same room lifting weights that he's lifted. I was there because they let me compete if I clean up the chairs after. God. That's how it works. But it's go ahead.
Oh, he's an absolute unit, man. And he's strong, incredibly strong. He's looking at I believe he's shooting for 110 kilo total at his next meet. He's training with Matt right now for that. And But that's how we had to like create a little bit of posterior expansion for him. And again, the only reason we even started looking at that is because he was getting so much discomfort in his upper back because of the constant concentric orientation, like tonicity of that tissue, right? It was actually started limiting his ability to deadlift because of the pain, right? So we had to just create that shape for him to be able to use. And, so when we start looking at this within the specificity of a sport, like I completely agree. Training age matters so much. Like I've trained youth athletes in the past. I would never do breathing interventions with them. I just want them to go play. We get in the weight room. We're going to train. We're going to let them self-organize. We're going to see what's happening. 14-year-olds aren't displaying movement competencies in the absence of injury more often than not, right? Like just let them figure it out and self-organize. Excuse me. But when you're looking at people who have trained a lot, like you said, and adopted the position that their sport requires, like that's what I'll usually tell people is like every environment has task demands, right? Especially high stress athletic environments. So if you're a power lifter, you're going to be wide just based on the big three, right? Because you're going to have extension as a sport specific strategy for all three of those lifts, especially if you pull sumo. If you pull conventional, you might be able to leverage a little bit more flexion, throughout, and you might have a little bit more overall variability. But we're talking about the bench and the squat, we're talking about getting as wide as possible to limit range of motion, right? Lift as much weight as you possibly can over the shortest distance possible is a pretty solid strategy for that. When we talk about sprinters, right? Same thing. When you look at the starting line at the 100 meter in the Olympics, what do you see? You see thoracic extension and anterior pelvic tilts, right? And part of that is because respiration probably isn't much of a need when you're running 10 seconds, right? It's a secondary thing, right? So creating a muscular strategy and eliciting power, now that's a primary strategy, and extension drives power, right? For the most part, where flexion drives like respiration and recovery for the most part, if you look at kind of like vague ends of a continuum. And one of our big things is we want people to be able to operate in both ends of that continuum, right? So we look at kind of at individual limitations based on their sporting requirements. And if they still, haven't reached the peak of that extension and being able to leverage that, we're going to drive it. Like we don't change anybody's comp lifts unless they're having like pain or issues with those comp lifts. Like we let them go. What we'll typically do is look at their accessory work specifically in the off season and try to drive a little bit more variability in different positions. And for like a guy like Will, like what that looks like is like Will might do a hook lying bench as his secondary press, but he's doing it for, he's doing 210 kilos for like sets of 6, right? Like it's heavy. It's still loaded. He's doing a hack squat, as a secondary, like fully loaded hack squat is like a secondary squat day, right? So these aren't like just floor-based or ground-based non-loaded drills. We're just looking at loading up these other positions as much as we can so we can drive a stimulus within them. Because again, like reiterating what you said, which is a beautiful point, if we're looking at these structural, adoptions, right, as compensatory strategies based on their sport, and we want to add another strategy in to overcome that outside of the sport, the stimulus has to be high enough to replicate the compensatory strategy, right? Or they're always going to default back into it as soon as they get back in that environment.
Right, because that's where their muscles know their leverage points based off of where their skeleton is. Now, question, and like again, just strictly born of genuine curiosity, when it comes to like a non-training or like someone with a lesser training age, would you see muscular strategies be the go-to default? Like, because you talked about Will and like the middle trap rhomboid pain. Now, in a clinical setting, it's something that I would see a lot in an undertrained population. So I work with software engineers at Apple, and when I first started, and they would have similar pain, right? But like none of them are deadlifting 400 kilos, right? Like none of them are the unit that Will Crozier is. But so in that case, and again, maybe it's a case where any stimulus would do, right? Because there is no stimulus whatsoever, right? So like I would look at something more towards a conventional strengthening. It's like, look, your erectors act, or I misspoke, your erectors function as anti-flexors. Mm-hmm. So your erectors are being, taken to task every single day, because you have this excessive thoracic kyphosis as a consequence of just sort of the job you're doing. So you're meeting thresholds. I was like, all right, we'll just build your threshold. Build your threshold of your thoracic erectors so you can do some sort of sandbag good morning, and those can function better under the sort of the autonomic load or autonomic function of anti-flexion of the thoracic spine, where that would be a total muscular intervention, devoid of any sort of rest, but not devoid of, obviously we want to be able to breathe and cue properly. And in the case like that, our breath is more likely going to be centered around making sure the lumbar spine is stable, and to what degree we put them in an environment where, like, they're chest supported or not is going to be contextual to the individual. But is there ever a point, and it's never going to be a complete 100% on either end, but do you sway scales to muscular interventions in certain cases, or in the untrained population, any stimulus, whether specific or novel, will likely be analgesic, so we're going to just go respiratory across the board?
So we will start those types of clients with the respiration strategy just so they become familiar with the position.
Right.
But we're loading it as quickly as possible.
Gotcha.
Right. And a lot of that's where we kind of differentiate like sensory motor interventions into like higher stimulus training, where we want to bring a general awareness to that person. Like you said, like the novelty will create kind of an autonomic response as far as like, oh shit, like I'm in a new position. Like I need to figure out how this feels and become antiquated and adapted to it, familiar with it. And then once that person is familiar with it, all we're going to do is use, constraints and different exercise selections to drive a stimulus within that position so that they can start becoming stronger within it. And I think that's where, the respiration-based stuff gets a really bad name. And I agree with a lot of what people say about it. I'm actually a big proponent of them overusing correctives rather than actually driving training stimulus. I think that's something that kind of realm of the industry has become associated with for really good reason, where they're not driving enough stimulus with the training to actually start getting good training effect with the clients. And you get a lot of clients who might feel better in the heat of a session, but as soon as they leave that session and, walk down the flight of steps out onto the street, we're kind of right back where we started, right? Because there just wasn't a large enough stimulus within the actual training session itself. And I think at some point for most people, you have to get past just the respiration-based stuff, and you have to start looking at muscular strategies. Because at the end of the day, you have to be able to support those structures, and you have to build familiarity with different muscular, different muscular integrations and different fiber orientations, getting back to neutral, being eccentric, being concentric, and different movement patterns from a strength perspective. If you really want to support that, what's happening with inhalation and exhalation.
Now, my question it's kind of evolving now into like internal versus external stability, right? Like, and understanding the stack and unstack and the rib cage over the pelvis and the ability to dissociate those two positions. Now, in my coffee-less fueled rant about the hook lying position, how is it that you cue for internal? I use the word stability a lot, and the S word seems to be something I have to go to bat for a lot when we start to enter into like the respiratory gait cycle community, and just like, oh, it's something that means you don't fall over. And it's like, that's a conversation maybe for another time, as I'll defend that to the deepest depths of the neurons in your cerebellum and somatosensory cortex. But when we look at like a hook lying position, the passive organization of the pelvis over the rib cage, or pelvis under the rib cage, or rib cage over pelvis, or if we look at something like you said, hack squat, and I think a lot of people may have lost I think I know why you said hack squat for someone like Crozier, because the hack squat's a more anteriorly loaded, right? We use it as an accessory because it is what I would consider a more output exercise, and it's going to block you from extension, right? We have this giant pad on our back. Now, how is it that you cue, or to to what degree do you value the superimposition of internal stability to maintain that position, rather than just training the muscles as a passive consequence of the external stability that's putting them in the position? So for those of you who cannot follow the Kyle Dobbs speed of like streaming consciousness, it's more so saying, if I were to do a hook lying position, what if I did, like, let's say a feet up bench press in a active hook lying position where my like core musculature, for lack of a better term, rectus and obliques, was internally stabilizing my pelvis in that stacked position versus putting a box under my feet where it's passive, or in a situation like a hack squat where the extension is mitigated by merely the environment we're putting you in. To what benefit can we then teach an association and co-contraction of the muscles that will create a more flexion bias through the trunk and minimize the extension bias in a squatting like pattern? Where do you place emphasis, or do you place emphasis on the use of the internal stability in presence of the external environment that's meant to create the stacked position? Or is it merely the fact of being in this position, training muscles is good enough?
So I think the big misconception is that the hook lying position is passive, right? You know, when I'm lining myself up in a hook lying position, I'm also digging my heels straight into that box, and I'm using my hamstrings to stabilize my pelvis. So I'm creating concentric orientation of the proximal hamstring and the adductor magnus to posteriorly tilt the pelvis out of extension, right, and create a more neutral relationship there. And then I'm actually using exhalation strategies to drive oblique action to stabilize the
like forced exhalation
on shoulder flexion, right? So on the concentric action of the press. So for me, it's like that for me is driving a kind of internal IAP based strategy built on utilizing respiration mechanics rather than having to cognitively brace my abs through a lift. Not that that's a bad thing. That's just not what I'm looking for within that variation, right? I'm looking to stabilize my, again, lumbothoracic cavity, whatever you want to call it, the space between my rib cage and my pelvis through the obliques and through creating diaphragmatic pressure and orientation with the pelvic floor. And when I'm doing more of an output-based bench, I'm driving my feet into the ground and I'm leveraging a little more extension, maybe I'm concentrically bracing my abs actively, then that's creating a muscular strategy where respiration is a secondary focus or even a tertiary focus or maybe a non-focus at all, depending on how many reps I'm doing. So again, I think it's looking at, do I want to brace myself through a muscular strategy or through a respiration strategy? And for me, that when I look at carryover to activity, right? If I'm a power lifter and I'm doing one rep under extremely heavy load, a muscular strategy is absolutely what I want to use. Like in that context, like I want to just Valsalva and go, right? Probably wear a belt, do all the things. If I'm running an 800 meter, I can't brace my abs through that entire thing. If I'm doing a set of, 10 to 15 squats, I probably can't do it on one breath, right? I certainly don't want to, right? So I have to be able to work through respiration strategies in that phase or in that set that are going to allow me to get oxygen into tissues so that I can actually complete the task itself. And I think we're just talking about two different outcomes and two different strategies for those things.
Yeah, because my biggest thing would be using the best tool for the right job, right? Like a set of 15 squats for me, and like I'm perhaps biased with my like powerlifting background, would be just a silly way to do anything. Like it's taking a screw and using a hammer to try to drive it in a wall. It's like, well, it's a half measure. It's like, why are we going 15 reps in? Are we trying to learn? It's like, well, maybe bouts of shorter volume would be a better way to learn, so we don't reach some sort of stress that'll then, depreciates the skill as that set goes on. And then it's like, well, are we trying to get really strong? It's like, we're probably not going to do that with sets of 15. So why are we going to be squatting for 15, right? So then you creating, and this is where the superimposition of internal and external stability comes in. I don't need to use that full-on muscular bracing in something like a hack squat, right? I can be much more efficient and economical in my breathing, and then perhaps use that tool better for what's intended. Because I do think there's a sliding scale of, the respiration and the muscular given the demand of spinal stability. Like that's really the only reason we send the diaphragm to the basement, blow out our rib cage in the process, and end up in this extension, is because we're just trying to create the greatest amount of spinal stability with muscular and respiration, right? So like, I'm not thinking about, well, I only have lungs in my rib cage. I'm thinking this 750 pounds is going to flatten me like a pancake. So I'm just going to go until my eyeballs burst out of my head. So it's like, I think the conversation was, we start to talk about respiration versus muscular strategies around bracing has to be contextualized to the outcome, kind of like you said, but also superimposing the internal and external stability and the demand of breath in the task we're attempting to complete for the exercise that we're implementing for the objective outcome of the training.
100%. And again, squats, insert any lift right in there. Anything that's going to be a higher repetition type base where you are going to be going through a respiration cycle, you are inhaling and exhaling across each rep, right? So, but yeah, I think that's, the context is always lost. And, whenever you're looking at social media and you're looking at what people are doing, very few people actually ask themselves why that person is doing that exercise that way, right? And again, like when you look at rep set schemes, if I'm doing an output-based bench, in this example, I'm very rarely going above 5 or 6 reps. And if I'm doing a hook lying bench, I'm probably in that 8 to 12 range, for the most part. And I am looking at a lower percentage 1RM. I am looking at a different strategy as far as how I want to lift that, and how I want to organize myself within that training. So again, different strategies for different outputs based on that, different ranges of motion I'm exploring, but also different percentages of load, right? Different intensities, different volumes of training to go along with those things respectively. What about different mediums? Because like if my thought process goes like, okay, if we're going to go the hook lying bench, and if it's a measure of auto regulation, primarily we're using less load. If it's a measure of greater range of motion by improving the relative organization of the pelvis and the rib cage, and then subsequently like obviously the femoral acetabular joint, but in this case more so like the actual glenohumeral joint and scapulothoracic joints. Does then, if the adaptation we're attempting to drive primarily with the hook lying position, if it moves to range of motion or moves range of motion up the list and tries to be a pendulum swing to the other side of range of motion being minimized through this extension posture that we find ourselves in competition lift, do you feel you lose specificity by going dumbbell, swinging too far to the other to create more range of motion? Like, what's your thought process on using a medium, like a switching to dumbbell or switching to kettlebell or cable or machine as we manipulate the rib cage position as yet another variable in training? We do all three of those, right? Depending on what phase somebody's in and what we're trying to get out of it, and we'll do dumbbell, we'll do bilateral dumbbell, we'll do alternating reciprocal dumbbell as well to drive more lateral compression of the rib cage too. If you have cables accessible to you, I think a standing cable press is a great way to also drive that. I don't have a dual cable at my gym, so you'll see a lot of dumbbells and kettlebells, within my training. But I also like that that kettlebell variation because you're manipulating the loading scheme and you're driving more adduction of the humerus just through a more lateralized load. With the kettlebell itself. So again, I think utilizing all those things, especially if you're using those variations for variability, the more exposure to the more types of stimulus, the better off you're probably going to be. And that's where, like with our programming, the main bilateral lifts are typically pretty linear from an organization perspective and how we progress those things through. But we really keep kind of a concurrent model for our accessory lifts. And we swap in a lot of different variations of things over the course of even a singular phase, because it's like all that is like secondary press for us, or secondary squat pattern, or secondary, hinge pattern. We don't have to be specific in what we're driving there because it's still a variation of the global pattern itself. And we're specific enough on our primary lifts that we're getting that stimulus. So the accessory lift is all just about exposure to different vectors, different modalities, different force curves, whatever, and just making sure that person has, again, the most variability possible over the course of that, 6 to 8 week phase. Through the squatting pattern, what is like your primary squat? And it sounds like a stupid question on the surface. Your primary squat, because like if I got to a point where I was flew to New York just so I could like put a microphone in front of Pat and a gun in front of him and be like, say squatty squats are like not the only way to squat. If I see another squatty squat, I'm going to pull the fucking trigger, and Marcus is going to have to come in here and peel me off, because like he just says stuff and then he just goes on with his day. And it's like, hey, what about squatty squats? I'm like, just go talk to Pat. Fuck. But it's like, because here's kind of one of my things with
I don't like, I'm in dealing with athletes, and obviously the context is going to matter. I never see something, like, I don't ever see non-specificity, right? Like I don't ever see general. I see less specific to specific, right? Because like when we're dealing with exercise and we're dealing with off seasons, and you know, you have someone going to the playoffs or going to a championship, their off season is very short. So we need to still sort of de-stress and, you know, get them out of certain shapes and certain systems, right? And be able to give them exposure to these pendulum swings from one side to the other. So the shape of the sport, the system that they operate in. But it's like you have a condensed window of time. So it's like, I can't go like, yeah, we're going to go golfing today. It's like, you're a lineman. Why are we going? Oh, it's general. It's like, you're not 15 anymore. It doesn't fucking matter if you play 7 sports in the off season. It's like, we need, you know, less specific to very specific. So it's like when I see like the squatting pattern and the squatty squats, before I just cinch the noose up to some high thing and just jump, it's like, because the dissociation, and like I see it with like the heels elevated, camber or safety squat bar, Hatfield, very organized pelvis position. It's like, what is your hierarchy of squatting patterns from primary into accessory? Like, where do the squatty squats come in? Is a squatty squat? I can't stop myself from saying this, but does it turn into much like a hook lying press as an equivalent ribcage pelvis accessory auto regulation, or does it ever find its way into a primary movement? Like, I couldn't imagine it would.
Yeah, it depends obviously on who the athlete is and what they do. Like if we're training powerlifters, it's definitely a secondary application, right? Because there is a high level of specificity there. If I'm training people who, you know, again, want to max load anything, like a barbell back squat is what we'll use for that, right? If that fits their preferences. I think morphology and biomechanics associated with morphology also matters here a little bit. Like I'm almost 6'6", and my barbell back squat, it like legitimately looks like a good morning. Sure. When I load it up to anything. And for like my goals right now, from like a running perspective and the things that I want to do, it doesn't make any sense, right? So my personal primary squat typically is a Hatfield, and that allows me to get a lot more knee flexion. It allows me to get deeper into a hole, and allows me to overload a stimulus. So I use that a lot for my own personal training. It's definitely not what we use for everybody's training, you know? So I think you also have to look at the individual in respective to, you know, a few things like what they're good at, how they're structured individually, and what they actually have available to them, especially like in the COVID area, because not everybody has. I mean, I love, like, Pat's great, and I love Pat's training, and he's my boy, but he's also got a full Kaiser showroom, right? And it's like he's showing all this stuff, and it's like, cool, like 1% of, you know, the training population that watches you can actually do these things. But
100% of the geriatric population has air pressure machines. I die 1,000 deaths every time I'm at that gym. But dude, I can't send it. Like, clang and bang is now like, if I hit the eject button, am I gonna fly into fucking Union Square? Like, what are we doing here? Dude, awesome. It kills me. It's like, where are the weights? Like, oh, there's 25 pounds on it, but there's 700 pounds of air. I was like, I need iron. I'm too big of a meathead pot. Yeah. I can't just go balls deep on. That's, you know what that is? That's my balls leaving my fucking soul. Like, what are we doing here?
Done.
Oh, man. Yeah. Because my biggest thing with the squatty squat is, like, obviously, like, integrated, what we'll call compound movements, are going to be something that, like, you create muscular torque as we unhinge, as we unstack, right? And I think that's something that, like, you know what you need? You need a poster, because, like, I know you're tall. I've talked to people who've worked with you, and, like, I know you're this just gargantuan human being. But all your videos when you train, like, it's just you doing your thing, and you're in this massive warehouse, so there's nothing there for space. Yeah. You need to carry around like a cardboard cutout. Like, this guy's 5'10", and then
it's just a normal size human,
right? Because, like, when I do, every time I see, like, the rotation of, like, the propulsion arc, right? The IR, ER, IR, and it's like I see it superimposed over, like, a 5'6" Asian female Olympic weightlifter. I'm like, guys, what are we doing here? I'm fucking 6 foot 275. Like, the dissociation creates torque, right? And that torque is an expression of power and strength, right? So it's like, and, like, again, watching you train and, like, watching you run and then do dips and then press, and it's like, okay, this guy's and he's 6'6" BTW. Like, by the fucking way, you're a behemoth. But when I see it, it's like, when I see it in practice, it's always like, it's the unloaded, it's the lack of integration. It's, we're totally externally stabilized, and they get it. Like the Hatfield setup would be a good, like if you didn't have a hack squat, it's like, well, we're we're externally stabilizing this environment for a moment of greater knee flexion while organizing pelvis and ribcage. Beautiful, love it. But it's like it's my biggest thing is the staying in safe mode. Be dangerous in safe mode, so you can then take a foot out of safe mode and unhinge and be unhinged.
Yep.
Like that's that's just a hard part. Again, context is everything, but it's almost like, I forget what what Austin Powers movie it is. It's like, we're not so different, you and I, because I feel like we're looking at the two sides of the same coin. But it's the context in which the audience takes in the information, and then they take it and they run away with it. Please.
Oh, I was gonna say that's something that my business partner Matt Domney, who trains all of our powerlifters, for anybody on this that doesn't know who he is, like, it drives him absolutely crazy, right? And that's something like the whole squatty squat phenomenon, and it's fine, like in the right context, but it's just a pendulum swinging to the opposite end, right? Where people are getting so scared of extension, they're going to extreme flexion, right? And I've even seen people in my little niche or my little, ecosystem, cueing people to posteriorly tilt their pelvis under maximal load, right? And it's just like,
right, because
what are we doing here,
right? Because it's like the retraction of the scapula, though.
Yeah.
Right. Like if we're finding ourselves in extension and we're doing something like a Zercher or a front-loaded squat, it's that people need to realize the difference between neutralizing a very anteroverted or posteriorly orientating a neutral. It's like, it's all, again, this pendulum of like, of perspective. And it's funny because you touched on something earlier and I wanted to bring it up again. And it's like how people always see things statically, right? And you've covered it sort of, it's bled through this entire conversation, is people view things statically in their conceptualization because they're only taught to assess things statically. Right? And it's like my biggest thing, because like it's a weird sentence. I'm not a big breathing guy. It's like probably when I'm asleep, that's kind of the case because I have sleep apnea. So I'm not a big breathing guy while I'm asleep. But it's like, not define, like it's not my thing, but like I look at human function evolve through walking and breathing. So gait cycle being, obviously the driver of the main hub of the pelvis and into peripheral hubs of the hip and integrating into the hub of the spine up into sort of the peripheral hub of the shoulder via that central hub of the rib cage. So it's like I look at those two adaptations and I think, okay, walking and breathing, like there's no such thing, like even with stretching, right? And like, not to go too deep down a rabbit hole of like efficacy versus effectiveness and static stretching, whatever, but it's like there's no such thing. As long as you're not in a coffin and being carried by 6, there's nothing is ever static, right? So I think the difficulty in understanding, like, the spin off of like the posterior tilt versus the anterior tilt relative to the position. Are you posteriorly tilting or are you posteriorly tilted is two totally different things. It's all because we're always assessing, right? We're never not assessing. And the assessments are, albeit they could start static, like, our conversation earlier about infrasternal angles, right? And understanding that, look, this could be a compensation over time and given like the direction of load and the patterns in which we've moved in over time. But that is an expression of a very dynamic movement that happens, however many times a day, however many times a week. So if we're breathing and inhaling into our most efficient sort of nooks and crannies of our rib cage, like nothing about that is static. So even the assessment that we think is static is the most dynamic thing we do. Our pelvis is going to, our pelvis and rib cage are going to be a direct consequence of the two most dynamic things, walking and breathing.
Yeah. And I mean, that's why, like, when I look at assessment, like that's also like we have a primary, secondary, and like tertiary kind of assessment buckets, like when we're looking at clients. And the primary assessment is ISA and gait, because everybody walks and breathes. And like you said, the ISA itself it's a moment in time, right? And that's why we kind of try to validate that then through like secondary assessments that are going to be more active based, so we can see how and we actually save a lot of that stuff for the joint by joint stuff is like a tertiary assessment, right? Where like my secondary assessments are typically like, okay, like, let me see you body weight squat, see how you self-organize. Let me see how you do a toe touch. Can you expand through your thoracic and lumbar spines, right? Accordingly. Let me see you do a push-up. Are you dumping your rib cage? Can you move your scaps? Let me see like an overhead flexion drill, bilateral and unilateral. Can I see, again, like, can you organize a scapula and a humerus on a rib cage, or do you have to elevate it to get overhead? Even if you elevate it, can you actually get overhead, right? With a lot of our people, does it look different bilateral to unilateral because you're able to laterally compress your rib cage and get more of kind of the side flexion and extension and get more range of motion there? And if we see things that don't match, that's when we actually look at like the joint by joint stuff. And we look at like internal, external rotation of a humerus, of a femur, hip extension. It's always funny when we get into like our groups, we talk about assessments. Like we'll have, anywhere between 20 to 50 people on the Zoom call, right? And I can see most of their faces. I'm like, all right, raise your hand if you trained today. And they're all a bunch of coaches like, yeah, fuck yeah, we trained today. I'm like, cool. Like raise your hand if you have full hip extension. Fucking crickets, not a single one of them, right? And if it is somebody, it's probably the weakest, most detrained person on the entire call, right? So it's like no hands. I'm like, are you okay? Do you squat and deadlift? Like, do you still train, right? Like you can still train because like, again, like movement potential versus accessible movement are two very different things, right? And so we want to look at what people are able to access and leverage for their task, rather than like what their movement potential from just a joint articulation standpoint is. Because most of us don't use full quote unquote range of motion on anything throughout the day, whether that's respiration or whether that's shoulder flexion or whether that's hip extension. And should we get some exposure to those things? Sure. That's why we do things like a hook lying bench press every now and then. But does that not need to be a primary exercise? Probably not. Because you're limited in your ability to, again, output or receive stimulus or adapt to stimulus, right? So, that's what for me is always the big thing is like people are taking a lot of the sensory motor stuff and the secondary stuff and making it primary and using it as an excuse to not train, in a lot of cases. And that's hard to swallow. And it's like, that's what I meant by even like that many people shared that with me. I was like, fuck, I got to change my messaging a little bit because apparently nobody thinks I train hard anymore. And I have to like
I think
go
once
about
people
that.
realize that you're 6'6", all of a sudden their whole perspective of you is going to change.
Well, I also have a 6'9" wingspan. People are like, why don't you bench press more? I'm like, dude, do you see the range of motion I try to bench press with?
Like,
it's
dude,
fucking stupid.
Your hook lying range of motion is like, you're going to find out if that gym has a basement.
I'm going to touch the top of the rack with the bar, so Jesus. It's always interesting. But yeah, that's one of the big things that, again, contextually, Matt and I had to make a lot of changes like in our social media messaging, like over the last year, because we were getting lumped into stuff
right
that we didn't agree with at all, just by association, right? Like I'll get tagged with like the same like 5 or 6 names and like stories, and I just can't even reshare them. I'm just like, oh fuck, like, God damn. Like no. It's like PRI people who don't train, right? And I'm just like, God damn it, like, yeah. I don't want to be there, And it's like, so it's one of those things for me where social media is a glimpse of what you do. And we try to, like you said, we try to be as authentic and transparent as possible as to what we do. So people do have an understanding of what we're about. And like our only non-negotiable when it comes to training is effort and work.
Right.
Like I don't necessarily care what your goals are. I don't care what your preferred style of training is. Like we can adapt some of our principles to those things typically. But if you're not going to bring it every day, it doesn't fucking matter what you do. And we don't care.
And that's the intangible stuff, right? And that's the hard thing to get across. Like I had a similar issue with kettlebell bottom under press and hip airplanes. Dude, I just like, hey, you're going full range excursion through function of like rotator cuff and lateral hip and adductors as secondary stabilizers of the pelvis. And I literally had to like stop one of my lectures last week. It was actually the one I'm going to hop on in a few hours here and be like, guys, it's mobility, stability, strength. Enough of the stability shit. I get it. Stand on one leg. Incredible. And this one girl in our, Ashley, a girl who's in our current cohort in our current semester, She did like a 45-pound weighted pull-up for 3-second concentrics. I was like, there you go. It's like, this is what I resonate with. This is what I want. More of that. Don't tag me in your single leg shit. Put your fucking kettlebells down. I don't care. It's like, once where there's bars in hands, now this is, because it's licensing the ability to do that. Like, no one cares about the prereqs. Right? If you went to Harvard, you're not going to tip like, oh, I went to fucking, Dubuque, Iowa State. It's like, no, I don't care. It's like, hit me with the top of the line stuff. And it's, over time, you can self-select for, the prerequisite work required to get to that point. Right? Like, you take a Crozier, for example, he's one of the strongest men in the world. It's like, to stay one of the strongest men in the world, you are going to have to appease prerequisites over time. Sometimes you can get there without doing it. You could just be a kid from Queensland who just hits his head off shit until he gets to the other side. But he knows, and he's one of the more like cerebral lifters I've ever come across. He knows in order to stay there, it's like, look, I need to employ a more sustainable approach over time. Hence, Dominic and your involvement with his programming and Jamie's involvement with his programming prior to that. And it's like, that's the exclusion criteria, is like, yeah, you can get to the top, but how long can you stay there? That's really going to be a direct consequence of like the cerebral thought process in your program, in your exercise selection, in your assessment process, and in your progressions and regressions, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And Matt actually, he made like an armbar post, like, I don't know, a month or two ago, that just got him a ton of flack on the internet, especially like with our crowd. And it was actually, people thought he was like taking a direct shot at like some people in the PRI community, but he was actually trolling Will, because Will sent him a video of him doing an armbar with like a 24 kilo bell. And he's like, Will, you bench press 500 pounds. Like, what do you think this is doing for you? Like, get a 44 kilo and go. Like, take your respirator, like, do something that's actually hard. Like, the stimulus here isn't enough to do anything once you actually get under your weight, So again, it's like that stuff, like your example of your girl with the pull-ups, right? If she's doing that, she's stabilizing a scapula just fine. She's got all the stability in the world. Like that is a expression and display of stability, right? Like, if you can squat 700 pounds, you're stable as fuck. Like, you have amazing stability at that point, right? You are a self-organized machine, and you're ready to go. So like, that's what I always try to come across too, is like and we talk about it a lot too, kind of a similar thing. Like, stability without strength is actually probably more risky than anything else, because all you're doing is creating a larger range of motion that you can't protect, that you can't like organize under load.
Yeah, because I would maybe dig into that a little bit, because it's like mobility would be the active range, like mobility without strength, because stability is going to be governed. And this is where the conversation, and this is where I want to sit down with, it'd be great to get you back in New York, me, you and Pat and Matt in a room, because like stability being quantified is like something's likelihood to fall over really kind of like irks, because like stability to me being like, the muscle spindles integration in with like dorsal spinal thalamic tract, and then we can talk about vestibulocerebellar and like kind of overall governing tone within the body itself. Like, stability, when like attempted to train, you are only going to be able to, be mobile within the ranges that your body will allow you to stabilize. Otherwise, your body just doesn't let you get there. So if I see someone with poor range of motion, I know you can't stabilize over here if your body's telling you can't get into this position. So like, if I see someone at 130 degrees of shoulder flexion, it's like, this is my overhead mobility, I'm going to go do pull-ups. It's like, you probably don't really have, it's your body telling you probably don't really have the ability to organize in that advanced position of shoulder flexion. And you're now going to be dual purposing the lat to stabilize in an eccentric load. And it's like, yeah, you can have big lats, but like your teres minor, for example, when you start to go in this advanced degree of shoulder flexion that you were never in, probably does not have any sort of idea where the hell you are. Right. And then like, and because I want to spend a few hours digging into stability, because obviously it's a tagline in my business. I'm married to it. I just might as well be tattooed on my fucking forehead at this point. But it's like that idea that like, okay, if you can be strong here, there must be an exhibition of stability. I think is like, rather than just range of motion, where I think it was range of motion and mobility, active range is in my mind, governed by our body's ability to map internally using proprioception via muscle spindle relay into the cerebellum and somatosensory cortex in order to tell our body where it is. It's our internal motion capture, right? And a lot of times if we can't be mobile into these positions, it's because our body loses contact with these, Gollum ping pong ball lycra suit motion capture within our body and our muscle spindles. So it's like, okay, let's spend some time hacking this, putting the ping pong balls there, and then expressing sort of bandwidth through that circuit.
I mean, with the thing that always just mystifies me the most regarding the concept around stretching, right? Again, I don't want to get into the efficacy of it necessarily, but like, if you've done any base level anatomy course, like, that, all you're doing from a stretching perspective is, again, adapting like Golgi tendon responders, right? And decreasing tonicity within muscles for passive range of motion. And that's why, like, for the last 10, 15 years of our lives, people have been like, hey, maybe it's not a great idea to stretch right before you train because you might be desensitizing things, right? And yet people still think, we're actually changing tissue lengths, and that might be a good thing to actually be working within a training program. And it might actually be causing long-term change when, the reality of it is like, and that's kind of what I meant. Mobility might've been a better word than stability for my phrase, but like what we're doing, like if you're opening up ranges of motion that you don't actually have access to do under stress or stimulus, even if that stimulus is just gravity, right? Or just your body weight and how you respond to gravity. Yeah, like there's definitely exercises that probably should be off the shelf for you that you can train yourself into over time, but they're not day one, right? They're not day one, or there's a lot of ways. And like that pull up, right? Like that's where you see people like go into a ton of thoracic extension and external rotation, because now you're leveraging, like, cool, like I can't get my lats to leverage that position or my teres minor to leverage that position. So I'm just going to use my traps and my rhomboids to just hammer in like scapular retraction instead of depression, right? Or humeral, extension from that perspective. And I think that's even, I saw you, it was you like post a long time ago, even like the difference in like that lat pull down, right? Where it's like, you're looking at like retraction versus not exactly. Right. And that's something that, when I saw that, I was like, God damn, that's a PRI lift that Jordan's doing over there.
I'm going to delete it. I'm deleting it.
But it's like, but again, it's like looking at these principles through different lenses. But if we're looking at a human skeleton and we understand how muscles work, we're coming to the same conclusion. We're just taking different routes there. And like, if I'm looking at it from a PRI perspective, which again, I use like 5 to 10% of PRI stuff in my actual training, regardless of my association at this point. But all I'm looking at is like, can I create posterior expansion and humeral extension at the same time? Right. So can I keep the scaps neutral or even a little protracted and drive the humerus down into extension to actually grab the lats rather than those scapular retractors along the spine?
Yeah. And this, and I think just giving yourself a breadth, like I look at it like a kaleidoscope, right? Like looking through a kaleidoscope of potential adaptations. It's like understanding the rib cage and the pelvis, to me, just, I don't know if you've ever done any sort of hallucinogenics, but like when I look at programming, it's just like it folds in like 2 red pill, blue pill sort of matrices and allows you to kind of just see things in a way that like, oh, okay, this is, my clients have no idea, which is kind of the frustrating part. It's like they just see reps and sets, and I just tell them like, round your back a little bit more when you're doing bicep curls this way. Like, what do you mean? Like, can I kind of just shove your elbows forward and like really kind of tuck your ribs down like this? It's like, yeah. Why? It's like, just do it, man. Because you got 32 weeks till September 9th, and that's when the season starts. It's like because you pay me, that's why. But it's like, training, like watching training becomes so much more fun when you're looking at it through this mushroom hallucinogenic kaleidoscope of adaptation, because it's like a magic trick, right? It's like watching you train, like your lat pull down, for example, to me is, people might be like, oh, that's strange. He's like doing like a rope crunchy kind of thing. And it's like, oh, I see, like, that to me is like a magician going up to another magician and being like, pulling the ties out of his sleeve, and goes, oh, you think that's good? Here's a rabbit. Here you go. Yeah. Right. So it's neat to be able to like open up people and have people see things and just different variabilities within training, different things they can manipulate, different stimulus that they can manipulate to help, create a more like tailored, bespoke program. And I just think, yeah, some context around some of that I think was super helpful on both sides, because I think I get looked at as like this hater meathead. It's just like, what is the deal with this guy? Like, his blood pressure is always high. He's always yelling about shit. Like is he hurting himself all the time? Like, what's going on? And then the pendulum swing to the other side, and you know, kind of owned up to the misrepresentation of like, oh, maybe the hook line is like, no, guys, he's 6'6", and he's like squatting, benching, deadlifting, sprinting. Like he's essentially Clark Kent. It's like there's when you kind of center us both, and you're like, oh, okay, like they're saying literally the exact same thing.
I mean, I think that's always a big thing, you know, and this is, God, we talk to so many professionals that, again, are coming from different educational systems and whatever. But we're all trying to get to the same place. You know, at the end of the day, it's like, we're all dealing with the same skeleton. We're all dealing with the same musculature. We're trying to impact it or influence it through different means sometimes, just based off our own bias, our own experience, whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like, if you can't look at somebody else's stuff and find similarities rather than just differences, like, you're not being very objective, and you're definitely not critical thinking, you know, about, you know, what they're doing. And that's where like I love social media. Like, again, like people who, you know, like hate on social media, it's like, well, what are you exposing yourself to? Like, I don't fucking follow people that I don't like to see their stuff. I don't interact with people who are trolling me. Like, I hit the block button quick on people. Like, you come onto my post, start talking shit, I'm like, you're probably not bringing anything to my life. Click. You know, so it's like, I have a great time on social media, and like, I can look at like your stuff. I can look at Pat's stuff. I can look at like Chasm's stuff within one. I can look at other people's stuff and be like, oh, man, we're doing a lot of the same stuff. We're just, you know, maybe using a little bit different language based on our education, but we're coming to a lot of the same conclusions when it comes to just movement and biomechanics. And, you know, I tell people all the time, it's like, man, like, none of us know. Like, we're all just like fucking shitting in the woods and stumbling around. Like, it's not, you know, it's like one of those things where it's like, it's impossible to quantify fitness. Like, that's why I always laugh at people who's like, where's your research? It's like, have you ever looked into research and fitness? Like, half of it's done on animals. None of it has a controlled population. None of the researchers fucking train and know what to even look for when it comes to like measuring these things. So it's like fitness research and like study is ridiculous. And it's something that's not even worth citing most of the time. Right. So it's like, we're all just kind of stumbled around and trying to figure out what works, you know, and you see a lot of people coming from different directions that are coming across the same solutions in a lot of cases. And I think that's what you have to actually look for. And that person who's just completely the opposite of that, that's the person you got to be like,
all right, Siedelman, you're done. You're off the team. All right. Like, it's a low hanging. You're all thinking it. I just said it. Fight.
Who was going through my head was the GOATA guys, because that's who.
Oh, dude. Yeah, you know, so here's the thing. I feel bad about Siedelman. I've spoken with him a few times, and like, I think he's just trolling the world at this point. It
might be.
One of the guys I work with, two of his teammates in the NFL were like training with him the other day. I was like, you gotta holler at your boys. Like, something's going on here. But the GOATA guys like go after and like
they're aggressive,
which is
aggressive.
Like, dude, it's like he's like angry dad. It's like, what the fuck are you doing, man? Like, you're going like I've never heard of you outside of being like a shit troll online. And it's like, at the end of the day, it comes down to like, who wants to throw hands? Who wants to throw hands? Who's willing to die on their sword? Right? Like, who wants Kyle Dobbs chasing him down like a fucking gazelle on the Animal Planet? Right? Like, you don't want that? No, then shut the fuck up.
Those guys, it's like the functional patterns guy kind of calmed down a little bit, and they like stepped right into that niche of like just being overly aggressive on the internet.
The agitator. It's like, because the problem is, and COVID's exacerbated this, like, real life still exists. Like, I'm going to be at a conference or something someday, and it's like, you're going to have to deal with like me and the Space Jam all-star team of like coaches. Like, hey, that's it, get him. And it's like, you're like Bill Murray in this equation. Like, I wouldn't be, you know, the old, if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones. But it's like, because everything exists online, it's like, fuck it, I'm just going to say it. It's like, there are consequences. And yet, but neither here nor there.
You're going to have to own that at some point. Someday.
But that's dude, I appreciate you taking the time, man. I feel like we could do this all day. You know, it'd be fun if we could actually organize at some point, obviously with like the current state of things. I'm so sick of even having to just recognize that verbally in every podcast or email segment. I know they're crazy times. But it'd be cool to get like a lift, like organize it so we can just go train somewhere, hopefully New York, if New York is ever New York again. But yeah, I do appreciate you taking the time. First just reaching out and not like, I don't know, reposting something and like slandering me and my company because we have a slight contextual, not even disagreement, but that's neither here nor there. But I appreciate you taking your time. I know your time is valuable, as we sort of cited at the top of the hour. I think this is super valuable. And like, this is the time of the podcast, and every podcast that you've done, go on and tell people where you live, where's your home address and all that shit. Where can they find you on the internet? Like, I know you're right through a semester right now, or a quarter of the mentorship, but kind of give some details on that.
Yeah, I mean, everything's on the website for us. It's compoundperformance.com, and you can see our training options, our trainer development and education options. And then the easiest way to just like contact and message either Matt or I through social media on Instagram. Neither one of us fucks with Facebook or Twitter or anything else. Like, Instagram's hard enough to deal with. So we're on there. We're pretty responsive to that. You can kind of see what we do and how we do it at that point. And, it's most of our stories are just Matt and I trolling each other back and forth. We unlike some people, we troll each other more than we troll other people for the most part. So for the context there, so we're pretty good about that. But yeah, the easiest way is just, slide in the DMs and ask us questions, and see what we're about.
Yeah, I'd highly recommend it. I like your Q&As are one of my go-tos. Whenever I see you're putting up a Q&A, I think you're able to give context in a contextual, barren wasteland of Instagram. So it's always fun to kind of watch you navigate those. But dude, again, I appreciate your time, guys. Compound Performance, Kyle Dobbs, and your business partner Matt Domney, definitely worth, in my opinion, for what it's worth checking out. I like the stuff you guys are putting out, and I do appreciate you taking the time and having the candor and professionalism to kind of hopefully not waste an afternoon chatting with me. But again, man, thank you so much for coming on.
Not at all, man. I appreciate you having me. Always an honor.